Tell us in the comments where in the world you are watching from and at what time, so I can get to know you better. To support the channel for free, don't forget to subscribe and like the video. They were the warrior monks, the first multinational corporation, the bankers of kings, and the guardians of Christendom's most sacred relics. For nearly 2 centuries, the Knights Templar were one of the most powerful and secretive organizations in history. Their iconic red cross on a white mantle, a symbol of both unwavering faith and unparalleled martial prowess. But how did a humble order of 9 knights, sworn to protect pilgrims, amass such incredible wealth and influence that even popes and monarchs feared them? And how did it all come crashing down in a storm of heresy, torture, and betrayal, seemingly overnight? Join us as we journey back through time to uncover the incredible true story of the rise and fall of the Knights Templar. The year is 1119. 2 decades have passed since the soldiers of the First Crusade stormed the gates of Jerusalem, reclaiming the Holy City for Christendom. Yet, victory has not brought peace. The roads of the newly established Kingdom of Jerusalem are treacherous, infested with bandits and marauders who prey on the vulnerable. For the thousands of devout pilgrims journeying from Europe to walk in the footsteps of Christ, the final leg of their spiritual quest, from the port of Jaffa to the Holy Sepulchre, is often a deadly one. They arrive seeking salvation, but many find only robbery and death. It is in this crucible of faith and violence that our story begins. From the ranks of the crusading knights who remained in the Holy Land, 2 men, a French nobleman named Hugues de Payens and his kinsman Godfrey de Saint-Omer, stepped forward with a radical proposal. They approached King Baldwin II of Jerusalem, not with a request for land or title, but with a solemn vow. They, along with 7 other knights, would dedicate their lives to a singular, humble purpose: the protection of these Christian pilgrims. This small brotherhood of 9 would form a new kind of religious community, one that fused the piety of the monastery with the martial prowess of the battlefield. They called themselves the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. King Baldwin, recognizing the dire need for such a service, granted them a headquarters in a wing of his own palace, a site believed to stand upon the ruins of Solomon's temple itself, the Al-Aqsa Mosque. From this sacred location, they would derive their more common name, the Knights Templar. For nearly a decade, these 9 knights operated in obscurity and poverty. Their emblem, 2 knights sharing a single horse, became a powerful symbol of their destitution and brotherhood. They owned nothing, their lives sworn to God and to the protection of his followers. They were a tiny, almost insignificant presence in the grand, violent tapestry of the Crusader states, yet they were planting the seeds of an organization that would grow to challenge kings and popes, an order whose power, wealth, and mystery would echo for centuries. For 9 long years, the poor fellow soldiers of Christ toiled in the Holy Land, a small band bound by a noble oath, but lacking the resources and official sanction needed to truly fulfill their mission. Their numbers remained stagnant, their influence limited. Hugues de Payens understood that for his fledgling order to survive, let alone thrive, it needed the ultimate seal of approval, the blessing of the Roman Catholic Church. In 1127, he and several of his fellow knights embarked on a journey back to Europe, a recruiting and fundraising tour that would culminate in a pivotal moment in their history. Their most crucial ally would not be a king or a prince, but a Cistercian abbot of immense influence and spiritual authority, Bernard of Clairvaux. Bernard was perhaps the most powerful voice in Christendom, a man whose words could sway popes and launch crusades. He saw in the Templars the physical embodiment of his ideals, a new knighthood, fighting not for personal glory or earthly gain, but for the glory of God. He became their fiercest champion, penning a treatise, De Laude Novae Militiae, or In Praise of the New Knighthood, which articulated the theological justification for a warrior monk. He argued that a Templar could kill an enemy of Christ without sin, for it was not homicide, but malicide, the killing of evil itself. Armed with Bernard's powerful endorsement, Hugues de Payan arrived at the Council of Troyes in January 1129. The council, a gathering of the great churchmen of France, formally recognized the Knights Templar as a religious and military order. Guided by Bernard, they drafted the Latin Rule, a strict code of conduct that would govern every aspect of a Templar's life. This was their moment of birth. With the Pope's sanction, the Templars were transformed overnight from a small, private militia into an official army of the Church, answerable only to the pontiff himself. Donations of money, land, and, most importantly, new recruits began to pour in from across Europe. The 9 humble knights had become the foundation of a multinational corporation of faith and war, an institution whose power would soon rival that of any kingdom. The official recognition at the Council of Troyes gave the Knights Templar legitimacy. The Latin Rule gave them their soul. This detailed code of 72 clauses, largely inspired by the ascetic principles of Bernard of Clairvaux and the Cistercian order, was the blueprint for creating the ultimate holy warrior. It was a radical fusion of the discipline of the cloister and the ferocity of the barracks, demanding a level of devotion that was absolute. At its core were the 3 traditional monastic vows: poverty, chastity, and obedience. The vow of poverty was total. A knight, upon entering the order, surrendered all his worldly possessions. He could own nothing, not even the horse he rode or the armor that protected him. Everything belonged to the order. This was meant to free him from material distraction and greed, focusing his entire being on his sacred duty. The vow of chastity was equally severe. Templars were forbidden from marrying or having any physical contact with women, including their own mothers or sisters. This was designed to ensure their purity and prevent earthly attachments that might compromise their loyalty to God and the order. The vow of obedience was the cornerstone of their military effectiveness. A Templar knight owed unquestioning obedience to his superiors, culminating in the Grandmaster. On the battlefield, this translated into an unbreakable, disciplined fighting force that would hold its position or charge into impossible odds without hesitation. Their daily life was a rigorous cycle of prayer and preparation for war. They attended multiple church services, starting before dawn. Meals were taken in silence, listening to readings from the scripture. Their diet was simple, with meat restricted to a few days a week to mortify the flesh. Their appearance was also regulated. They wore simple white mantles, symbolizing purity, later adorned with the iconic red cross. They were required to grow beards, a sign of masculine strength, and keep their hair short. Any breach of this strict code was met with harsh punishment, from fasting and penance to flogging or even expulsion. The Latin rule forged men of iron will, creating a brotherhood of elite soldiers who believed they were enacting God's will on earth. Warriors who feared sin far more than they feared death. While the Knights Templar were forged for war, their most lasting legacy may well have been in the world of finance. Born from the practical need to protect pilgrims, the order inadvertently created one of the most sophisticated international banking systems the world had ever seen. The problem was simple. A pilgrim or crusader traveling from London or Paris to Jerusalem needed funds for their long journey, but carrying vast quantities of gold and silver was an open invitation to thieves. The Templars, with their fortified preceptories scattered across Europe and the Holy Land, and their reputation as incorruptible warrior monks, were uniquely positioned to solve this problem. They devised a system of credit that was revolutionary for its time. A nobleman in France could deposit his fortune at the local Templar house. In return, he would receive a letter of credit, a piece of parchment inscribed with a complex cipher known only to the order. This document was worthless to a robber. Upon arriving safely in Acre or Jerusalem, the nobleman could present his letter at the Templar headquarters there. The Templar scribes would verify the cipher and dispense the equivalent amount in local currency, minus a service fee. It was the medieval equivalent of a traveler's check or a wire transfer, an innovation that greased the wheels of the entire crusading movement. This system rapidly expanded. The Templars became the trusted bankers for the nobility and royalty of Europe. They managed estates, collected taxes, and issued loans. Their Paris temple became the de facto treasury of France, and other strongholds served similar functions across the continent. Their military might guarantee the security of these deposits, and their papal charter placed them beyond the reach of local kings, making them a truly independent financial power. This immense wealth, generated not just from donations, but from their own shrewd financial dealings, allowed them to fund massive building projects, field large armies, and exert political influence far beyond the battlefield. However, this very success sowed the seeds of their destruction. To be the creditor to kings is a dangerous position. The Templars' financial power, once their greatest strength, would eventually inspire a fatal combination of greed, jealousy, and fear in the hearts of the very monarchs they served. While the Knights Templar carved out their legend in the sun-scorched landscapes of the Holy Land, the true engine of their power was being meticulously constructed thousands of miles away, in the heartlands of Christian Europe. This was an empire not of conquered territory, but of influence, faith, and finance, built upon a network of establishments known as preceptories or commanderies. Following their official sanctioning at the Council of Troy in 1129, the order experienced an explosion in popularity. Nobles, kings, and commoners alike, inspired by the Templars' pious mission, bestowed upon them vast donations of land, property, and wealth. From the rolling hills of France to the shores of England and across Spain, Portugal, and the German states, the white mantle with the red cross became a symbol of immense prestige and spiritual authority. Each preceptory served as a local headquarters, a combination of monastery, recruitment depot, and administrative center. They were agricultural powerhouses, managing vast estates with innovative farming techniques that generated significant revenue. These were not merely passive land holdings. They were dynamic economic hubs. The Templars managed forests, mills, vineyards, and markets, turning donations of raw land into streams of gold that flowed eastward to fund the endless war for Jerusalem. More than just farms, these preceptories were the backbone of the order's logistical and recruitment machine. They were where new brothers were initiated, where squires were trained, and where aging or wounded knights could retire in service. It was from these European bases that men, horses, and equipment were constantly dispatched to reinforce the garrisons of Outremer. This sprawling network also facilitated the order's pioneering role in international banking. A pilgrim in London could deposit his funds at the London Temple, receive a letter of credit, and withdraw the equivalent amount in Jerusalem, a revolutionary system that protected travelers from the perils of carrying large sums of money. This infrastructure of preceptories was the Templars' secret weapon, a European empire of logistics and finance that made their military endeavors in the Holy Land possible. Before they became bankers to kings and masters of siegecraft, the Knights Templar were born from a single, humble, yet profoundly dangerous purpose: to protect the vulnerable. The very name of the order, the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and the Temple of Solomon, spoke to this foundational mission. In the early 12th century, after the First Crusade had successfully captured Jerusalem, the roads of the newly established Kingdom of Jerusalem were anything but safe. For the thousands of devout Christians who undertook the arduous pilgrimage to walk in the footsteps of their Savior, the final leg of the journey was often the most perilous. From the port city of Jaffa to the holy sites of Jerusalem, the rocky passes and narrow defiles were infested with bandits, marauders, and remnants of defeated Fatimid armies who preyed on unarmed travelers. It was a grim reality that a journey of faith could easily end in robbery, enslavement, or death. In response to this crisis, the French knight Hugues de Payens and 8 of his relatives and acquaintances approached King Baldwin II of Jerusalem around 1119. They proposed the formation of a monastic order dedicated solely to the protection of these pilgrims. They took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and their mission was blessed by the king, who granted them quarters in a wing of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, believed to stand on the site of Solomon's Temple, the origin of their name. In their early years, the Templars were few in number, a small band of knights whose poverty was so pronounced that, according to legend, their first seal depicted 2 knights sharing a single horse. Yet, their dedication was absolute. They patrolled the treacherous road to Jerusalem, acting as an armed escort for pilgrim caravans. Their presence alone was a deterrent, and their willingness to engage any threat, regardless of the odds, quickly earned them a reputation for courage and reliability. This sacred duty was the bedrock of their identity and the reason for their existence. It was this visible, tangible act of piety and protection that captured the imagination of Christendom and fueled the flood of donations and recruits that would transform them from a small brotherhood into a global powerhouse. As the Crusader states clung precariously to their territories in the Holy Land, surrounded by hostile forces, survival depended on more than just battlefield valor. It depended on stone, strategy, and the ability to withstand a siege. In this arena, the Knights Templar proved themselves to be unparalleled masters of military engineering and fortification. Entrusted with defending the most volatile frontiers and strategic locations, the Order embarked on a castle-building program of breathtaking scale and sophistication. These were not the simple Motte and Bailey castles of Europe. These were colossal fortresses, designed to project power and serve as bastions of Christian military strength. Templar castles incorporated cutting-edge defensive architecture, often blending the best of Western and Byzantine designs with innovations born from the unique challenges of the region. They pioneered the use of concentric defenses, with multiple layers of walls creating deadly killing grounds for any attacker who breached the outer perimeter. Towers were often rounded to better deflect projectiles from siege engines, and cunningly placed machicolations and arrow slits provided defenders with superior fields of fire. Perhaps the most famous of these was Château Pèlerin, or Atlik Castle, built on a peninsula south of Haifa. Constructed between 1217 and 1221, it was a masterpiece of military design, with 2 massive walls and a formidable inner keep, capable of housing a garrison of 4,000 troops. It was so well defended that it was never taken by force, only abandoned after the fall of Acre in 1291. Other key fortresses like Safed, which guarded the Galilee, and Chastel Blanc in Syria, stood as symbols of Templar dominance. These castles were more than just defensive structures. They were administrative centers, supply depots, and safe havens for local Christian populations. They anchored the frontiers, controlled vital trade routes, and allowed small Templar garrisons to hold vast territories against much larger enemy forces. The sheer expense and logistical complexity of building and maintaining these fortresses underscored the immense resources the order could command, a testament to the European financial empire that fueled their holy war. In the annals of the Crusades, few battles so perfectly encapsulate the combination of fanatical courage, tactical brilliance, and sheer improbable luck as the Battle of Montgisard. Fought on November 25, 1177, it stands as a testament to the formidable fighting prowess of the Knights Templar and the indomitable will of the Kingdom of Jerusalem's young, leprous king, Baldwin IV. The situation was dire. The great Sultan Saladin, having consolidated his power in Egypt and Syria, had invaded the Kingdom of Jerusalem with a massive army, estimated at over 26,000 soldiers. The bulk of the Crusader army had moved to counter a different threat, leaving the road to Jerusalem perilously open. All that stood in Saladin's way was a tiny, hastily assembled force led by the 16-year-old King Baldwin. His army numbered fewer than 4,000 men, including just 375 knights. Among this small contingent of elite warriors was a crucial force of 80 Knights Templar, led by their Grandmaster, Odo of Saint-Amand. Saladin, contemptuous of the minuscule army before him, grew careless. He allowed his massive force to become spread out, many of his men foraging and plundering the countryside near the hill of Montgisard, believing the battle already won. He had fatally underestimated his opponent. Despite being racked by leprosy, which had crippled his body but not his spirit, Baldwin IV ordered a charge. At the vanguard were the Templars. In a move of breathtaking audacity, the small Crusader force crested a hill and crashed down upon the unprepared center of Saladin's army. The impact of the heavy cavalry charge, led by the disciplined and fearless Templars, was devastating. They tore through the Sultan's personal bodyguard of Mamluks, shattering the enemy's command structure and inducing a mass panic that rippled through the entire Saracen army. What followed was not a battle, but a rout. But Saladin himself barely escaped capture, and his magnificent army dissolved, pursued, and harried for miles by the victorious Crusaders. the victory was so total, so utterly against the odds, that it was universally hailed as a miracle, a clear sign of God's favor. For the Knights Templar, Montgisard cemented their legend as the ultimate shock troops of Christendom, warriors whose faith made them fearless in the face of impossible odds. For nearly 2 centuries, the Knights Templar were not just soldiers of Christ. They were the keepers of Christendom's most profound mysteries. Stationed atop the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, on the very ruins of Solomon's Temple, their position alone was enough to ignite the imagination of medieval Europe. What secrets lay buried beneath their headquarters, the Al-Aqsa Mosque? It was a question that fueled a mythology that would outlive the order itself. Legends swirled that the knights were not mere guardians, but excavators who had unearthed the greatest relics of the biblical age. Whispers spoke of the Ark of the Covenant, its divine power now harnessed by the Order, or perhaps the Holy Grail, the cup from the Last Supper, granting them prosperity and military prowess. These were more than just stories. They were potent symbols of the Templars' perceived special relationship with God. Their secretive initiation ceremonies, conducted behind closed doors, only added to the mystique. New recruits swore oaths of poverty, chastity, and obedience, but also of secrecy, forbidding them from revealing the inner workings of the chapter meetings. This veil of silence created a vacuum that was eagerly filled by speculation and suspicion. Were they practicing arcane rituals? Did they possess esoteric knowledge passed down from the time of Solomon? This aura of mystery was a double-edged sword. It attracted recruits and donations, helping to build their unprecedented international banking network, where a pilgrim could deposit money in London and withdraw it in Jerusalem using a coded Templar letter. But this same secrecy, combined with their immense wealth and political influence, bred resentment and fear. They were accountable only to the Pope, a status that placed them beyond the reach of kings and bishops, further isolating them. The myths of hidden knowledge and unimaginable relics that once defined their power would eventually be twisted into accusations of heresy and idolatry, providing the very justification their enemies needed to bring the mighty order to its knees. The summer of 1187 would bear witness to a catastrophe from which the Crusader states would never truly recover. The fate of the Kingdom of Jerusalem was sealed not in a grand siege, but in a sun-scorched, waterless plain between 2 hills known as the Horns of Hattin. It was a battle born of arrogance and poor leadership. Against the strenuous objections of his most experienced advisors, King Guy of Lusignan was goaded into marching his entire army out of the well-supplied city of Sephoria to relieve a siege on Tiberias. This was precisely the trap Saladin, the brilliant Sultan of Egypt and Syria, had laid. The Crusader army, a magnificent force of over 20,000 men, including the elite Templar and Hospitaller Knights, was a walking column of death. Dressed in heavy mail under the relentless July sun, they were harried at every step by Saladin's light cavalry. Their water supplies dwindled, then vanished. By the time they reached the arid plateau near Hattin, they were exhausted, dehydrated, and demoralized. Saladin's forces had already seized the only nearby spring. As night fell, the Sultan's men encircled the desperate Christian camp, their taunts and prayers echoing in the darkness while they set fire to the dry brush, choking the Crusaders with smoke. The morning of July 4th dawned on a scene of desperation. The Templars, under their Grandmaster Gérard de Riedfort, led several valiant but doomed charges. They fought with the ferocity for which they were renowned, but courage could not overcome thirst and exhaustion. The Crusader infantry broke ranks, scrambling up the hills in a futile search for relief, only to be cut down or captured. By the afternoon, the battle was over. King Guy was captured, and the holiest relic of Christendom, a fragment of the true cross, was lost to Saladin. For the Templars, the defeat was absolute. Nearly every knight who fought was either killed or captured. Saladin offered the captured Templars a choice: convert to Islam or die. To a man, they chose martyrdom, and over 200 were beheaded. Their sacrifice, a grim testament to the scale of the disaster. Hatton was not just a military loss. It was a spiritual and psychological blow that shattered the very foundation of the Crusader presence in the Holy Land. For a century after the disaster at Hatton, the city of Acre stood as a defiant symbol of Crusader resilience. It was the capital of the dwindling Kingdom of Jerusalem, a bustling port city teeming with merchants, pilgrims, and the powerful military orders. It was the last great bastion of Christian power in the Holy Land. But in the spring of 1291, its time ran out. The Mamluk Sultan of Egypt, Al-Ashraf Khalil, arrived before its formidable walls with an army of staggering proportions, numbering well over 100,000 soldiers and accompanied by an arsenal of colossal siege engines. Inside Acre, the defenders were a fraction of that number. A coalition of Templars, Hospitallers, Teutonic Knights, and soldiers from across Europe. Their defense was heroic, but ultimately hopeless. For weeks, the city endured a relentless bombardment. The Mamluk trebuchets, some so large they were given names, hurled massive stones that shattered Acre's ancient towers and walls day and night. The defenders launched daring counter-raids, led by the Templar Grandmaster Guillaume de Beaujeu. But they could do little to stop the methodical destruction. The sappers of the Mamluk army dug tunnels beneath the main towers, packing them with wood and setting them ablaze, causing entire sections of the wall to collapse. On May 18th, the final assault began. Mamluk warriors poured through the breaches in the walls, and the fighting descended into a brutal, street-by-street slaughter. Grandmaster de Beaujeu was mortally wounded, a final blow to the defenders' morale. As the city fell into chaos, thousands of civilians fled to the harbor, desperate to board the few remaining ships. The Templars made their final stand in their massive, fortified compound that jutted out into the sea. For 10 more days, this fortress within a fortress held out, a final island of defiance. But when the Mamluks undermined its main tower, it collapsed, killing defenders and attackers alike. The fall of Acre was the final, bloody punctuation mark on the end of the Crusader dream. The Holy Land was lost, and the era of Outremer was over. The smoke had barely cleared over the ruins of Acre when the few surviving Templars, along with the remnants of the other military orders and the Christian nobility, made their escape across the sea. Their destination was the island of Cyprus, the last Crusader kingdom in the east. For the Knights Templar, the retreat was a bitter pill. They had been founded with a singular sacred purpose: to protect pilgrims and defend the holy sites of Jerusalem. Now, with the Holy Land entirely under Mamluk control, that purpose had been rendered obsolete. Their very reason for existence had vanished with the fall of Acre. Cyprus became the Order's new administrative center, but it was a headquarters, without a front line. The Grandmaster and the Central Command established themselves in Limassol, overseeing an organization that was now, in effect, a government in exile. The Templars were far from broken financially. Their vast network of commanderies, farms, and banking houses across Europe continued to generate immense wealth. They were richer and more powerful than many European kingdoms. On Cyprus, they acquired significant lands and property, becoming major players in the island's politics and economy. They were a formidable military force without a war to fight. This created a profound identity crisis. The knights continued to train, their swords kept sharp, but for what? They launched a few minor raids against the Egyptian coast, more symbolic gestures than genuine attempts at reconquest. They even briefly captured the island of Ruad, a tiny foothold off the Syrian coast, only to lose it a few years later in another bloody last stand. The order was adrift. Without the clear, unifying mission of defending Jerusalem, internal politics and the management of their financial empire took precedence. They were a military solution to a problem that no longer existed, yet their power, wealth, and secrecy remained. This paradox made them vulnerable. In the courts of Europe, powerful men like King Philip IV of France began to look at the Templars not as heroes of Christendom, but as an arrogant, secretive, and fabulously wealthy organization whose purpose had expired. The retreat to Cyprus was not a new beginning. It was the beginning of the end. By the dawn of the 14th century, the Kingdom of France was the dominant power in Western Europe, and at its helm was King Philip IV. History would remember him as Philippe le Bel, Philip the Fair. This moniker, however, referred not to his sense of justice, but to his striking physical appearance. Beneath the handsome exterior was a mind of cold, calculating piety and ruthless ambition. Philip's reign was defined by a singular goal: the consolidation of royal power and the creation of a centralized French state. This ambition, however, came at an astronomical cost. His relentless wars against England and the Flemish cities had pushed the royal treasury to the brink of collapse. Philip was a king perpetually in need of money, and he was not scrupulous about how he acquired it. He repeatedly debased the coinage, levied crushing taxes, and targeted wealthy minority groups. In 1306, he had the Jewish population of France arrested, their property confiscated, and the people themselves expelled from the kingdom. He had done the same to the Lombard bankers. Yet these measures were mere drops in an ocean of debt. His gaze soon fell upon an even greater prize: the Knights Templar. The Templars were more than just a military order. They were a multinational corporation, a state within a state. For nearly 2 centuries, they had been the bankers to popes and kings, accumulating vast wealth, extensive land holdings, and a network of fortresses across Christendom. Crucially, they answered only to the Pope, an unacceptable affront to a monarch as absolutist as Philip. Their immense, untaxed wealth and their supranational autonomy made them an irresistible target. In Philip's eyes, they were a financial resource to be plundered and a political threat to be neutralized. The plan that began to form in the secret councils of the Louvre was not merely one of expropriation, but of complete and utter annihilation. He needed to not only take their money, but to destroy their very legitimacy. For this, he required a charge so heinous it would strip them of their holy mantle and papal protection. the king had a powerful, albeit reluctant ally in Pope Clement V, a Frenchman who had moved the papacy to Avignon, effectively placing it under the shadow of the French crown. The stage was being set for one of history's most infamous betrayals. Every great scheme requires an architect, and for Philip the Fair's audacious plan against the Templars, that architect was Guillaume de Nogaret. A layman from a minor noble family, Nogaret had risen through legal and administrative ranks to become the king's most trusted and feared advisor. He was a man defined by a fanatical devotion to the supremacy of the French crown and a deep-seated animosity towards any power that challenged it, particularly the papacy. Nogaret was no stranger to extreme measures. He had been the mastermind behind the 1303 assault on Pope Boniface VIII, an event known as the Outrage of Anagni, which left the pontiff humiliated and broken. He was a master of law, not as a tool for justice, but as a weapon to be wielded in the service of the state. It was Nogaret who spun the web of accusations that would ensnare the Templars. Drawing on rumors and the testimony of a disgruntled, expelled Templar, he crafted a list of charges designed for maximum shock and horror. These were not mere accusations of financial misconduct. They were a full-scale assault on the order's sacred identity. The Templars, he claimed, were a heretical sect. Their secret initiation rites allegedly required new recruits to deny Jesus Christ, to spit upon the crucifix, and to engage in obscene kisses. He accused them of institutionalized sodomy and of worshiping a demonic idol, a mysterious bearded head referred to as Baphomet. This litany of blasphemy, heresy, and depravity was meticulously designed. The charge of heresy was the legal key, as it allowed the secular authorities of the king to intervene in the affairs of a religious order and brought the dreaded machinery of the Inquisition into play. The secrecy that had always shrouded the Templars' internal rituals, once a source of their mystique and prestige, was now turned against them. With no outside witnesses to refute the claims, Nogaret's lurid fictions could fester in the public imagination. He circulated these charges in secret, building a case file that would serve as the justification for a swift, coordinated strike, ensuring that when the hammer fell, the Templars would be too discredited and reviled to mount any effective defense. Throughout the late summer of 1307, sealed parchments bearing the royal insignia made their way from Paris to every corner of the French kingdom. They were delivered to the king's seneschals, bailiffs, and regional officers with the strictest instructions. The seals were not to be broken until the night of Thursday, October 12th. As darkness fell across France that evening, hundreds of royal agents finally read their chilling orders. At dawn the following day, they were to mobilize their men, surround every Templar preceptory, commandery, and farm in their jurisdiction, and arrest every member of the order, from the highest-ranking commander to the lowliest serving brother. All Templar property and assets were to be seized in the name of the king. The operation was a masterpiece of secrecy and coordination. As the first light of Friday, October 13th, broke across the sky, the trap was sprung. Across the entire country, simultaneously, armed soldiers stormed the gates of Templar properties. The knights, famed for their military prowess, were caught completely unawares. They were not in a state of war, but in their homes, roused from their sleep, not by a call to arms, but by the splintering of doors. In Paris, the Grandmaster himself, Jacques de Molay, was taken into custody. Just days earlier, he had been an honored guest at the royal court, serving as a pallbearer at the funeral for Philip's sister-in-law. This proximity to the king made the betrayal all the more shocking. He and his knights offered little resistance, stunned into disbelief. How could this happen? They were the soldiers of Christ, answerable only to the Pope, their order showered with privileges for centuries. But their papal bulls were worthless against the steel of Philip's soldiers. Thousands of men were rounded up in a single morning. The efficiency of the operation was terrifying. Yet, as royal agents ransacked the Templar vaults, they were disappointed. The legendary great treasure of the Templars, the vast hoard of gold and silver coin, was nowhere to be found. Whether it was moved in anticipation of the arrests, or whether it never existed in that form, remains a mystery. But Philip had secured the real prize, the order's vast infrastructure of land and property. And with the knights in chains, the second phase of his plan could begin. With the Templars imprisoned, Philip the Fair needed to legitimize his actions. The arrests were technically illegal, as the Templars were subject only to papal authority. Philip's agents immediately began interrogations, but he needed the formal apparatus of the Church to secure a conviction of heresy. He exerted immense pressure on the wavering Pope Clement V, who reluctantly issued a papal bull authorizing an inquiry by the Inquisition. This gave the proceedings a veneer of ecclesiastical justice, but in reality, the trials were controlled by Philip's men. The primary instrument of this justice was torture. Inquisitorial procedure permitted the use of torture to extract the truth from suspected heretics, and Philip's interrogators employed it with systematic brutality. Knights were subjected to the rack, which stretched their limbs until their joints dislocated. They were hung by their wrists in a technique called the strappado, their shoulders torn from their sockets. Their feet were greased and held over fire, burning the flesh and bone. Under this unimaginable agony, the will of even the most resolute warrior was broken. They confessed. They confessed to everything, to spitting on the cross, to worshipping the head of Baphomet, to heresy and blasphemy. The Grandmaster Jacques de Molay, a man in his 60s, also confessed to some of the charges, likely in a desperate attempt to spare his brethren from further torment. These coerced confessions were meticulously recorded and presented as irrefutable proof of the order's guilt, creating a powerful wave of propaganda. However, a flicker of resistance remained. When dozens of knights were brought before a separate papal commission in 1310, away from their immediate torturers, they found the courage to speak the truth. One by one, they retracted their confessions, testifying that they had admitted to the false charges only under extreme duress and fear of death. Philip's response was swift and merciless. He declared that any Templar who retracted his confession was a relapsed heretic, a crime for which the punishment was death. On May 12, 1310, 54 of these defiant knights were slow roasted to death over a fire on a field outside Paris. This horrific spectacle sent a clear and unequivocal message to the remaining prisoners. Your confessions will stand, or you will burn. The retractions ceased. For 7 years, darkness had been his world. Jacques de Molay, the 23rd and final Grand Master of the Knights Templar, was a man forged in the crucible of the Holy Land, a warrior whose life had been dedicated to God and his order. Now, in the dungeons of Paris, he faced an enemy he had never been trained to fight. Not a Saracen warrior on the battlefield, but the insidious whispers of royal inquisitors in a cold stone cell. Arrested on the infamous Friday the 13th of October, 1307, the elderly Grand Master was subjected to relentless pressure. The charges leveled against him and his brethren were a litany of shock and blasphemy, heresy, idolatry, spitting on the cross, institutionalized sodomy. These accusations were the venomous ink in King Philip the Fair's pen, a monarch whose piety was dwarfed only by his staggering debts and his covetous gaze upon the Templars' immense wealth. Under the prolonged agony of torture, the old warrior's body gave way. He made a confession, a carefully worded admission to some of the charges, primarily the denial of Christ and the spitting on the cross during secret initiation rites. For the Inquisitors, it was a triumph. For de Molay, it was a moment of profound weakness, but perhaps also a calculated move. Historians speculate that these rituals were a form of psychological training, a way to prepare a knight for the horrors of capture and interrogation by the enemy, to teach him to deny his faith with his lips while holding it true in his heart. But in the hands of Philip's men, this secret trial of faith was twisted into a public declaration of heresy. Yet, as the days turned into years, languishing in prison, de Molay's spirit began to mend. He heard of how his confession was being used to condemn his brothers across France, many of whom were being burned at the stake for retracting confessions made under duress. The Grand Master's shame turned to resolve. He was not a heretic, and his order was not a den of blasphemers. He had been a pawn in a cynical game of power and greed. His defiance began to smolder in the gloom, a quiet, burning ember of resistance, waiting for one final moment to erupt into a cleansing flame. While Jacques de Molay languished in his cell, the fate of his order was being decided not by a trial of faith, but by a trial of political will. The stage for this final act was the Council of Vienne, convened in 1311. Pope Clement V, a Frenchman effectively held captive by King Philip's influence, was trapped. He had initiated the papal inquiries into the Templars, but the evidence presented was deeply flawed, consisting almost entirely of confessions extracted through brutal torture, many of which had been recanted the moment the threat of pain was removed. Many of the church leaders gathered at Vienne were deeply skeptical. They argued that condemning an entire holy order, one that had shed its blood for Christendom for nearly 2 centuries, on such tainted testimony, was an injustice. They demanded the Templars be given the right to properly defend themselves. But King Philip was not a man to be denied. In a stunning display of force, he arrived at Vienne in March 1312 with a significant military escort, making his desires unmistakably clear. The pressure on Pope Clement was immense. Cornered and politically outmaneuvered, Clement chose a path of administrative expediency over justice. On March 22, 1312, he issued the papal bull known as Vox in Excelso. Critically, the bull did not officially condemn the Knights Templar for heresy. Clement admitted that there was insufficient proof to do so. Instead, he decreed that the order was to be dissolved. He argued that its reputation had been so irrevocably tarnished by the scandal, and that the ongoing trial was causing such harm to the Church that its continued existence was untenable. It was a political dissolution, not a theological conviction. With the stroke of a pen, the Knights Templar, the formidable army of Christ, ceased to exist. A subsequent bull, ad providam, transferred the bulk of their vast estates and properties to their rivals, the Knights Hospitaller. King Philip, however, ensured he was handsomely compensated from these assets, claiming the costs of his vicious, years-long prosecution. The institution was dead, but its leaders were still alive, their final fate yet to be written. The end came on March 18th, 1314. On a scaffold erected before the Grand Cathedral of Notre Dame, Jacques de Molay and 3 other Templar leaders, including Geoffroy de Charnay, preceptor of Normandy, were brought out into the daylight for the first time in years. They were old, broken men, shadows of the powerful warriors they had once been. A crowd had gathered to witness the final chapter of the Great Templar scandal. The papal legates were to read the final verdict. Based on their earlier forced confessions, the men were to be sentenced to perpetual imprisonment. For King Philip and the church authorities, this was to be the end of the affair, a neat conclusion that would see the Templar leadership locked away forever, their voices silenced. But Jacques de Molay had other plans. As the sentence was read, a fire, long dormant, ignited within him. He and Geoffroy de Charnay suddenly found their voices shouting over the cardinals. They were not guilty. Their confessions were lies, forced from them by the pain of torture. They proclaimed the purity and holiness of the Templar order to the stunned crowd. It was an ultimate act of defiance, a choice to reclaim their honor at the cost of their lives. A life sentence in prison would mean a life defined by a lie. A death at the stake would be a martyr's end, a final fiery testament to the truth. King Philip, who was either present or nearby, was incandescent with rage. This public recanting was a direct challenge to his royal authority and the legitimacy of his entire campaign against the order. He considered them relapsed heretics, and their fate was now sealed. Bypassing any further consultation with the church, Philip made a swift and brutal decision. That very evening, on a small island in the River Seine, the Île aux Juifs, a pyre was constructed. As the flames licked at his feet, Jacques de Molay remained steadfast, reportedly asking to be turned to face Notre Dame and to have his hands untied so he could die in prayer. His final act was not that of a heretic, but of a martyr, his silhouette burning against the twilight sky of Paris, an eternal symbol of defiance against tyranny. As Jacques de Molay burned, legend claims he uttered one final, terrible prophecy. He is said to have summoned his persecutors, Pope Clement V and King Philip IV, to join him before the judgment of God within the year. Whether he actually spoke these words is lost to history, but what followed cemented the curse in the annals of legend. Pope Clement V died in agony from a sudden illness just 1 month later. Before the year was out, King Philip IV, the Iron King, was thrown from his horse during a hunt and died from the subsequent infection. The French monarchy he had fought so hard to strengthen was thrown into chaos, with his 3 sons ruling in quick, disastrous succession, ending the Capetian dynasty. For the common person, the connection was undeniable. The Grandmaster's curse was real. The immediate, practical legacy of the Templars was their absorption. Most of their assets went to the Hospitallers, and their surviving members were pensioned off or integrated into other orders. In Portugal, the order was cleverly rebranded as the Order of Christ, which would later fund the nation's Age of Discovery. But the more potent legacy was the one that grew in the shadows. The sudden, violent destruction of such a powerful and secretive organization created a vacuum that was quickly filled by myth and speculation. Where had their legendary treasure gone? Did a contingent of knights escape with their holiest relics, perhaps the Holy Grail or the Shroud of Turin? These questions gave birth to the enduring idea that the Templars did not truly die, but merely went underground, continuing their work in secret. Centuries later, emerging fraternities like the Freemasons would claim a direct lineage back to the Knights of the Temple, adopting their symbolism and lore. The story of the Templars endures because it is the ultimate tale of a fall from grace. It is a story of faith and finance, of piety and power, of a noble crusade corrupted by a king's greed. Their true legacy is twofold: a sobering historical lesson on how quickly justice can be subverted by power, and the creation of a romantic, inexhaustible mystery that continues to fascinate and inspire to this day.